Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture on China. This time we're talking about the Sui and Tang dynasties. Here are our key concepts for this time. But again, I don't want you guys to forget about the dynastic cycle from last time. It continues to play a really big role. Also, don't forget about Conrad Demarest. Even though the Han dynasty is the only one that's actually on your chart, the Conrad Demarest model can still apply here, as with any other empire or transition between them. Take a few more moments to read through these key concepts. And here are our key vocabulary terms. We're talking about the Sui and Tang dynasties today, and together those lasted from about 500s to 900s CE. And I'm actually going to mix things up today and start by talking about the why do we care, rather than ending with it. Because students oftentimes will ask, why do we have to even study all these dynasties? It just seems like it's one after the other after the other. Well, it's true that we go through these pretty quickly, but it's important for students to realize that actually most of these dynasties lasted quite a long time. And the time periods they were in power were actually much longer than the time periods that there was chaos or transition between the dynasties. The important thing about that is that the long periods of dynastic power created long periods of political stability. And those periods of political stability in part led to great inventions coming out of China, like paper, like the compass that we talked about last time, and like movable type, pictured here. Basically, Chinese society was producing more useful inventions along with Indian society, which we'll talk about later on, than almost anywhere else in the world at this time or before the Industrial Revolution. It also had one of the largest shares of the world's wealth, in large part because you're able to focus on creating things and being productive when you're not worried about your country's political security or your own personal security. Speaking of political security and insecurity, after the fall of the Han dynasty, there were a couple hundred years there where things were actually very politically insecure. But the Sui dynasty was the one who was responsible for reunifying China. Much like a few hundred years before that, the Qin dynasty reunified China after a period of warring states. Well, there was another period of warring states between the Han and the Sui ended that. I'm going to ask you guys, based on your knowledge of the dynastic cycle and based on your knowledge of the Conrad Demarest model, why do you think they were able to do it? Take about 3 minutes and make your best guess. So let's look at some possible answers. Well, there were regional governments that were already in place in the areas that the Sui reunified. The Sui had pre-existing military power that it used to achieve that reunification. And within the territories that it reunified, there was also similar ideology, similar philosophies that had been there for hundreds of years, similar culture. I could also put on here similar language. Qin Shi Huangdi, hundreds of years before, had already standardized the written language, so it was easy to reunify the people linguistically for that reason. I could also probably have put up here that they were successful in claiming the mandate of heaven, right? So do any of these things clearly connect to the Conrad Demarest model? If you're not taking a look at your model right now, you probably should be. Look for those connections, and you'll probably find some. Alright, so remember when I gave you that Chinese dynasty song? You might want to pull that back out again, because the one thing you want to remember about the Sui dynasty, even though it didn't last that long, is that it created this, the Grand Canal. And what the Grand Canal did as infrastructure for China was not only help to tame the waterways and control flooding and help with agriculture and irrigation. You can even see some fields on the sides of it right here today. But it really helped with communication and transportation, spread of goods, spread of ideas, altogether helping to unify China even further than it already had been under Qin Shi Huangdi. That all sounds like a great thing, right? How could it possibly be a failure of the Sui to build something like this? It has to be a success, right? Well, if you've done the reading in Spodek, you also know that upwards of 5 million people were forced into service to work on this thing. And we don't have exact figures, but we think tens of thousands of people died in the production of this, or suffered injuries that were essentially life-ending for them because they couldn't go on with their day-to-day activities afterwards. So this was not pleasant for the folks who put it together. And it caused widespread hatred and rebellion against the Sui. So this is actually a really interesting case study looking here at the Grand Canal. Where do we categorize it if we're going to put it someplace in the dynastic cycle? Is it something that goes with rebuilding and enhancing infrastructure? Is it something that goes with treating people unfairly? It's tough to say. What I can say with some certainty, though, is that many historians use the Grand Canal as a symbol of decline and failure for the Sui, and they place it over here under the treating people unfairly subsection of the old dynasty. There's actually a French term for the forced labor system that the Chinese used to build the Grand Canal, and it's called corvée. Technically, I believe this word means "this sucks." No, actually, it's just a term for forced labor, but like I said before, that forced labor really did stink for all the people who had to take part in it. And of course, it's what led to, in part at least, the loss of the Mandate of Heaven for the Sui and large-scale revolts that eventually overthrew it. But that's only, of course, half of the equation, right? We've seen through the Grand Canal at least one reason for the decline and fall of the Sui, but where did the Tang come from and why were they successful early on? Well, there's a lot more detail about this in Spodek, and I'm not going to go into detail here in an effort to keep this lecture much shorter, but I expect you to look at those details on your own and compare them to the dynastic cycle. The big ideas you should be seeing is that the Sui also didn't do a very good job of protecting people. Its military was weakening near the end. After these revolts, when the Tang start to come to power, they do a better job of that. They restructure and re-strengthen the military, and they're able to reinforce infrastructure like the Great Wall near the north of their boundaries and protect people again. Also, they're treating people more fairly, and they're redistributing land. That's a common trend we see at the beginning of new dynasties, and the Tang in its transition from the Sui is not much different in following this pattern. One of the most important things to remember about the Tang Dynasty, and probably the one thing, if nothing else, that I'd put on that Chinese Dynasties song about them to remember, is that they were the first dynasty to set up a standardized test that anybody who wanted to could take it, and if they did well enough, they would earn for themselves a position of power and influence and prestige in the government. So it didn't matter where you were born socially or what job you were expected to have, whether or not you were supposed to be a farmer your whole life or a merchant or whatever. If you studied for this test, which was actually about Confucian philosophy, and you proved you knew enough about it, you could theoretically come from any walk of life, any background, and be a member of the government and drastically increase your social rank. That was the theory, at least. But as we know, theory and practice aren't always the same thing. And the reality of this situation was that these tests were brutal. If you think the AP exam is going to be tough, it is nothing compared to what one of these tests was like. You had to study literally for years and devote your life almost entirely to study in order to even have a chance. What sort of people would have all that free time? Well, usually not a farmer's son. That person would have to be outside working in the fields, right, or helping with other household duties. We still see that even after the introduction of this exam, most of the people who are getting into government are either the children of really wealthy individuals or very high-ranking individuals who are already working in the government, or a mixture of both, because sometimes those two things went together. So it was incredibly rare that anybody from a lower class background was actually going to raise their status this way. Given this information, do you guys think that the Tang Dynasty counts as a meritocracy? What the heck is a meritocracy? You can see in this word merit, right? And merit is basically your strengths, or you doing a good job at something, right? Those are your merits. So a meritocracy is something where you can get ahead in life based on how good you are at something. In this case, based on how good you are at your knowledge of Confucian philosophy, right? Does Tang Dynasty China count as a meritocracy based on this information? Well, I'll let you guys decide that. But what themes are we talking about here? Definitely theme 3, because we're talking about political organization, right? And theme 5, because it relates to social class as well. Speaking of theme 3, which includes conflict, we're about to start talking about a battle, which is something we don't normally do in AP World History. It's not something we focus on, so get psyched. Specifically, we're going to talk about a battle that I bet none of you guys have heard of, but is really, really important for world history. And it's called the Battle of the Talas River. Happened in the mid-700s CE, and it took place between the Tang Dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate. We'll talk more about this caliphate when we start talking about Islam and the spread of Islam, but what you guys should know right now is that Islam was developing and spreading rapidly around this time. And the Tang Dynasty was actually expanding westward as the Abbasid Caliphate or Islamic Empire was expanding eastward. They met in this location in about 700 CE. On a map, you'll see that it's near the western border of China today. Why is it such an important battle? Because it's conflict that actually leads to cultural diffusion. And it's the diffusion, not the battle, that world historians are so interested in. So let me ask you guys to take 3 minutes and think to yourselves, how can conflict, how can battle lead to diffusion of ideas? Because it doesn't seem as though people who are fighting are in much of a mood to talk or trade, right? So how can conflict lead to cultural diffusion, and what world history themes are interacting here? Pause the video, I'll be back with you shortly. Okay, so theme-wise, we're talking about 3 and 2 here, of course, right? 3 is the conflict, and 2 is the cultural diffusion. But we haven't answered the question of how this diffusion happens in the first place. Well, the story goes that Chinese prisoners who were captured by the Abbasids were taken back to the Abbasid homeland where they brought their culture with them. The same thing happened on the other side. Abbasid prisoners who were captured by the Chinese were taken back to the Chinese homeland where the Abbasids brought their culture with them. What does this mean for both sides, and why should we care? Well, those Chinese inventions we've talked about over the past, paper, the compass, movable type, none of that stuff's ever going to reach the Western world without the help of the Middle Eastern peoples bringing them to the West. And Islam is not going to reach as far east as it does without the help of the Abbasids captured by the Chinese bringing it to the east. So you actually start to see those inventions from the Chinese diffuse west at the same time you start to see religions like Islam diffuse east and impact some notable characters from China later on. And one thing that was hidden for whatever reason for just a second back there was this bit of information down here. So make sure you get that as well. So I just talked about Islam reaching China and influencing some key people that we'll talk about later on, like Zheng He. Alright guys, we made it to our last slide in record time. There's a lot more detail about Chinese imperial expansion and cultural interaction with its neighbors in Spodek, and I need you guys to read that detail because it's important stuff. However, I've summarized and crammed all that detail here so that you can review it on your own and get the highlights. I'm not going to read this to you, but do know that this is important and it's merely a summary of the concepts I need you guys to get from the text. And that's it for our lecture today, guys. I will see you later on in class. Thanks for watching.